Good evening, welcome to Black and Blue Garage. Today we're going to talk about how I'm going to get power distribution from the engine compartment to the cab to the bed of the truck. This is basically a threaded stud which passes through a either a ceramic or plasticky insulator. So I could bolt these two holes onto the firewall or rivet them or however I choose. And then this plastic piece, and sometimes it's plastic, sometimes it's ceramic, depending on who you buy it from, can hold this in place, and you can send 12 volts power through this stud without contacting the frame or body, which would be ground. Also, I think this whole thing comes apart, so where, like, if you needed to replace this stud, you might be able to do that. It's just a nut that captures on both these sides. I do have a couple of options here because I can go through the firewall down here, and I even have a couple of holes left over from where the heater hoses came through that I could repurpose into putting wires that just go along here next to the exhaust, but far enough to where they wouldn't melt. But going with the theme of the bay tucked hood, mainly to keep most of the wiring out of this hot engine bay, but I also want it to look really cool. I dig the look of only seeing the engine wiring harness right here and on this side. And if I do my starter wire and my alternator and my winch wires a little differently, I can kind of get rid of these on top of the engine also, and I really like that. So next best option, it would take a little bit of work, but if I tapped through right here, which goes directly to the inside of the cab, I could cable tie my power lines to my conduit here and back in somewhere and come to the engine from the front, down where it's a little less noticeable. If you're wondering what that conduit is, it just has all the wires for my front lights. And it runs down into the side of the cab, up right outside where the passenger would have their right foot out that hole. So if I just put another hole right here, it'd come out right here, and that would just be perfect. Okay, now I've got a hole right where I want it. This thing fits in there just perfect. Something else I thought about too is if you mount this with your cable perpendicular to these mount holes here, you'll be fine. But if you somehow messed up and mounted it here and you don't have the right hardware in there, you could actually arc out your power to ground, and that wouldn't be good. Now it's on to making a cable or two that can go from this terminal, zip tie to this conduit and through the front, so we can get power to the engine and the winch. I only need to have one wire coming through right here, and in that case, since I'm not going to connect multiple things to this terminal, I can move this terminal to somewhere on the front here. That means I can use one of these pass-through grommets in this hole right here for the main source of power. So I bought this a little while ago, and these are pretty cool. Basically, what you've got is this main piece which clamps a hole in a firewall somewhere or a box, and you've got a rubber gasket that goes in between all these fingers, and then you've got this cap which squeezes all these fingers together, and that clamps down on this wire. You've got a pretty secure pass-through for any firewall, and you can put different sizes for different wires. You could even put several wires through one and clamp it down around some shrink wrap. So this is going to help me out a lot when I'm doing all this wiring stuff. Alright, that worked pretty good. So I've got this terminal here. This power cable goes all the way through and goes through one of those grommets. From there, we're coming inside the cab, and I've got to go up next to my cooler there, and it's going to come right to about here, and this right here is where I'm going to have the battery disconnect. Now I can use the terminals on the back of this battery disconnect as a power source that goes to my alternator wire. It only has to be that long now because it just goes from the alternator to that place that we put inside the fender right there. So I got my cable hooked up to there. It goes back behind the alternator bracket. It'll come up here, and I'll be able to stick that right on this terminal. I'll show you how I'm making the battery cables here, as I've stripped this back to about 3/4 of an inch, and I have the appropriate size terminal for both the wire and the lug. I'm going to put that on there. I've got this hydraulic crimper. What you want to do is make sure this valve is shut, and you just kind of pump this up. What I like about the about this style of crimper, and also the style of crimper where you can use a hammer, is you can really cinch down on that at the same time. You don't want to crimp that too tight, because that just damages the strands of wire inside here, and it can eventually, with enough vibration, break this joint right there. If you're using cheap shrink wrap like me, I like to take a couple of pieces and do it twice. Put your shrink wrap over that whole piece. I put it really close to the hole because as it shrinks, it'll get shorter as well. You take whatever heat source you want, be that a heat gun or a lighter, and shrink that up and make it look really nice. You don't always necessarily have to have shrink wrap over the lug, but it makes it look nice and professional, and in the case that anything does accidentally touch, you may never need it, but it's nice to have. There you go, one terminal put on. Now that wire specifically is going to go from my starter lug back there to where we're tying in with the alternator as well. You know, it just occurred to me that doing my wiring this way, setting up a couple of terminals between the engine and the battery, which is in the bed of the truck, is that if any of these wires go bad, or I have to replace any of them, I'm only having to replace a small, short section of it instead of the entire thing from the battery to the engine. Now, I want the wire we put through the firewall and the wire that goes to the battery both to go through this disconnect switch, and that's going to go right here on the dash. But because I don't have a panel here yet, I've just zip tied them where I know they're going to be terminated, and I left myself a few extra inches so that if I accidentally do something wrong, it's longer rather than shorter. And this wire here is going to go along the right side of the passenger side. Now that I have power run from the battery and alternator to the back right corner of the cab, I can actually take those two wires and run them out the bottom of the bed like I planned. I hooked it up to the battery, but because I'm also going to run a suck down winch in the back and maybe a winch to pull me backward, I may just put a power distribution box down here somewhere, which will also make it easier to disconnect and remove this entire bed when it comes time to work on stuff. We're going to be using something like this. This is called a riv nut. It's threaded on the inside, and you basically crimp this into the hole, and you can basically bolt anything to any thin sheet metal that you want. What's really nice about this distribution block is it comes with a cover that you can put over to give you that little bit of extra protection. Now I know what you're thinking. That's a whole lot of connections to get all of your battery power to everywhere. But since I do want to put the battery in the bed of the truck, and because I want to keep the wires clean in the engine bay, this is how I've decided to do it. It might not be the most efficient. If I ever lose a connection somewhere, I'll know exactly where to look. And with the exception of having to take a fender off, everything is pretty much easy to get to. So I know wiring is not that interesting, but I'm still having fun building. Tune in next weekend and we'll show you some more. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Who welded this?